The question people keep circling back to isn't new, but it's grown sharper with time. Who is really pulling the strings with Betty Whittaker? Not who's helping her. Not who claims to be protecting her. But who is shaping her choices, narrowing her options, and deciding what parts of her voice the world is allowed to hear. For a long time, Betty was exactly what she appeared to be. An older woman living a hard life in a remote place, speaking plainly, answering calls freely, and interacting with the same small circle of people she'd known for years. She was open. Sometimes too open. But she was consistent. People recognized her tone, her pacing, her confusion, and her clarity. It was familiar. Then something changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. No announcement. No confrontation. Just a quiet shift that only people close to her noticed. Calls that once went through didn't anymore. Messages sat unanswered. Longtime contacts found themselves blocked or ignored without explanation. When they did manage to reach her, the conversations felt different. Shorter. Guarded. Guided. People who knew Betty well began saying the same thing independently. It didn't sound like she was speaking freely anymore. It sounded like she was being managed. That's when the name Gloria began circulating. Not a relative. Not a lifelong friend. Not someone who had been part of Betty's world before everything else started unraveling. She appeared suddenly, right at the moment Betty's life became legally and financially complicated. And almost immediately, access to Betty became restricted. Gloria wasn't just present. She was central. People noticed she was often nearby during phone calls. Her voice could sometimes be heard off camera. She corrected Betty. Finished her sentences. Redirected her answers. If Betty hesitated, Gloria stepped in. If Betty sounded uncertain, Gloria smoothed it over. Over time, a disturbing pattern emerged. Betty's voice didn't disappear completely. It narrowed. Instead of expressing uncertainty, she repeated phrases. Instead of asking questions, she deferred. Instead of explaining things in her own way, she relied on rehearsed responses. Those watching closely began to ask a difficult question. Was Betty making decisions, or was she being coached into them? That question becomes even heavier when you consider the timing. This shift didn't happen during a quiet period in Betty's life. It happened when she was facing things she had never navigated before. Legal paperwork. Financial disputes. Agreements with long-term consequences. Concepts that would overwhelm many people with full support systems and legal representation. Betty didn't have that. What she had was someone telling her what to do. According to people who claim first-hand knowledge, Gloria didn't just offer advice. She allegedly controlled access. She allegedly decided who Betty spoke to and who she didn't. She allegedly framed certain people as trouble and others as the only ones trying to help. That language matters. When someone repeatedly tells a vulnerable person that only one voice can be trusted, it creates dependency. When they frame outside input as dangerous or disruptive, they isolate. When they present themselves as the filter between the world and that person, they gain power. This isn't speculation pulled from thin air. It's a pattern people recognized only after comparing notes. Individually, each moment might seem insignificant. Together, they paint a picture that's hard to ignore. And then there's the second name that keeps surfacing. His involvement is where concern escalates into alarm. Because Eric isn't just described as someone offering help. He's described as someone with a history in the Whittaker story. Someone whose interests are directly tied to decisions Betty is being pressured to make. According to multiple claims circulating within the community, Gloria isn't acting independently. She's allegedly repeating guidance, reinforcing narratives, pushing outcomes that align closely with Eric's goals. If that's true, then Gloria isn't a protector. She's an intermediary. People who say they've witnessed this dynamic describe similar scenarios. Betty hesitates. Betty expresses confusion. Betty says she doesn't understand something. And then the reassurance comes, not in the form of explanation, but instruction. Just sign it. It's fine. You don't need to talk to them. Eric says this is the right thing. That's not informed consent. That's compliance. What makes this especially troubling is Betty's vulnerability. She is elderly. She has documented cognitive limitations. She has lived most of her life without formal education, legal advocacy, or financial literacy. That doesn't make her incapable of making decisions. But it does mean those decisions require support that is transparent, neutral, and accountable. Control masquerading as care is one of the most dangerous forms of exploitation. And this is where things take an even darker turn. People claim there is a specific document at the center of all this pressure. A document Betty is being urged to sign quickly. Not after consultation. Not after independent review. Quickly. According to these claims, the document isn't just about settling a dispute or handling money. It has broader implications. It could shift who has authority to speak for Betty, who can make decisions on her behalf, who controls her interactions, her agreements, her future. In other words, it's not just about finances. It's about autonomy. That's why the urgency matters. If Betty signs without fully understanding, the consequences could be permanent. And once that authority shifts, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. People watching this unfold have started asking why the pressure is so intense. Why the sudden rush? Why the need to isolate Betty at the exact moment these decisions are being made? According to some insiders, it's because the plan only works if Betty remains controlled. If she hears other perspectives, if she asks the wrong questions, if she speaks freely to the wrong person, everything could unravel. There are also claims that evidence exists. Messages, recordings, screenshots, some of it allegedly already public, hiding in plain sight. Moments caught on camera where Betty's behavior shifts mid-sentence, where a whisper off-screen changes what she says next. Once you notice it, it's hard to unsee. The most chilling part of all this isn't the possibility of manipulation. It's how quietly it can happen. No shouting. No visible force. Just repetition. That's how people lose agency without realizing it's happening. Right now, everything hinges on whether Betty gets the chance to slow down, to speak freely, to receive advice from someone who doesn't benefit from her decisions, to understand, truly understand, what she's being asked to sign. Because if she doesn't, the outcome won't just affect money or paperwork. It will affect her voice, her independence, her ability to tell her own story. And that brings us back to the central question. Who is really pulling the strings with Betty Whittaker? Is it someone acting in her best interest? Or someone positioning themselves to control the narrative, the decisions, and the outcome? This isn't about assigning guilt. It's about recognizing patterns, asking hard questions, and refusing to look away when something feels wrong. Now it's your turn. What do you see happening here? Do you believe Betty is being protected or managed? Where do you draw the line between help and control? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Once people began asking who was pulling the strings with Betty Whittaker, the focus shifted from personalities to patterns. Because manipulation, when it happens, rarely announces itself. It hides inside routines, inside help, inside the idea that someone else knows better. The first pattern people noticed was isolation. Isolation doesn't always look like someone being locked away. More often, it looks like access being quietly controlled. Calls that suddenly go unanswered. Messages that never get delivered. Familiar voices framed as bad influences. New voices framed as the only ones who care. That's exactly what people say began happening around Betty. Longtime contacts described the same experience. They didn't argue with her. They didn't threaten her. They didn't pressure her. They simply found themselves shut out. And when they asked why, they didn't hear it from Betty directly. They heard it secondhand. Or not at all. When communication did happen, it felt different. Betty's speech pattern changed. She stopped explaining things in her own words. Instead, she repeated phrases. Short, definitive statements that didn't sound like how she normally talked. Statements that shut conversations down instead of opening them up. This is where people started comparing notes. Individually, each interaction could be explained away. Just confusion, fatigue. But collectively, they formed a consistent picture. Betty wasn't just overwhelmed. She was being directed. And direction is not the same as support. Support explains. Direction instructs. People began asking a critical question. Who benefits from Betty not asking questions? That question led straight back to legal and financial pressure. Betty was suddenly being asked to deal with documents she had never handled before. Agreements written in language most people struggle to understand even with legal counsel. Deadlines. Consequences. Permanent outcomes. Under normal circumstances, that's when independent advisors step in. Lawyers. Advocates. Neutral third parties whose job is to ensure understanding, not compliance. But that wasn't what was happening here. According to multiple accounts, Gloria positioned herself as the filter. She explained things in simplified terms. She reassured Betty that everything was fine. She discouraged outside input by framing it as confusion, drama, or danger. That framing is powerful. When someone repeatedly tells a vulnerable person that asking questions will only make things worse, they stop asking. When they're told that dissenting voices are harmful, they stop listening. Over time, compliance begins to feel like safety. That's how autonomy erodes without force. The second pattern people noticed was urgency. Not urgency created by a court deadline or an emergency, but manufactured urgency. The kind that pressures someone to act before they can think. We need to do this now. Don't wait. If you hesitate, you'll lose everything. Urgency narrows options. It discourages second opinions. It makes hesitation feel dangerous. Why was there such a rush? According to those raising concerns, the urgency made sense only if someone needed Betty's signature before she spoke to the wrong person. Before she gained clarity. Before she realized she had alternatives. This is where Eric's name becomes unavoidable. People who've followed the Whittaker situation closely know Eric isn't a neutral figure. He's someone whose interests intersect directly with Betty's decisions. That alone doesn't prove wrongdoing. But it does demand scrutiny. What alarms people isn't just Eric's involvement. It's the alignment. The language Betty uses suddenly matches language Eric has used publicly. The positions Betty takes suddenly mirror Eric's interests. The people Betty avoids are the same people Eric has clashed with. That alignment doesn't happen by accident. According to insiders, Gloria repeatedly reinforced Eric's perspective. Not by debating. Not by explaining both sides. But by presenting it as the only reasonable option. Eric is the only one helping you. They're just trying to cause problems. You don't need to hear that. That kind of messaging doesn't empower. It confines. Another pattern that raised alarms was substitution. Instead of Betty speaking for herself, others began speaking for her. If she hesitated, someone else answered. If she struggled to explain, someone finished the thought. Over time, Betty's role shifted from decision-maker to figurehead. That's a dangerous shift. Because once someone gets used to speaking for another person, it becomes easy to justify making decisions for them. Especially if those decisions are framed as being in their best interest. The problem is, Best interest is subjective. And when the person defining it stands to gain, it becomes exploitation. People also began pointing out behavioral cues caught on video. Moments where Betty starts to say one thing, then stops. Her eyes flick to the side. Her posture stiffens. She changes her answer. These aren't dramatic moments. They're subtle. But subtlety is exactly how influence hides. It's the difference between someone choosing silence and someone being silenced. Observers noticed that Betty appeared more anxious during these interactions. Less confident. More deferential. That alone doesn't prove manipulation, but it adds context. Especially when paired with reports that she expressed confusion privately. According to claims, there were moments when Betty admitted she didn't fully understand what she was being asked to sign. Moments when she wanted reassurance beyond, "It's fine." Moments when she asked questions that went unanswered. That's not informed consent. Consent requires understanding. Understanding requires time, explanation, and freedom to ask questions. None of those thrive under pressure and control. What makes this situation especially serious is Betty's age and cognitive limitations. That doesn't mean she can't make decisions. It means the standard for ethical support is higher, not lower. Ethical support looks like patience, like transparency, like encouraging independent advice. What people describe here looks very different. It looks like dependency being cultivated. Dependency isn't created overnight. It's built slowly, through reassurance, through repetition, through positioning oneself as indispensable. Once someone believes they can't manage without you, you control their choices. That's the core concern people are raising. Not that Betty has help, but that the help comes with strings. And those strings appear to tighten whenever Betty shows signs of independence. The biggest fear voiced by observers is that this isn't just about one document. It's about precedent. Once control is established in one area, it spreads. Financial decisions lead to legal authority. Legal authority leads to total control. And once that happens, Betty's voice may never fully return. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a pattern professionals who work with vulnerable adults recognize immediately. Isolation, urgency, substitution, alignment of interests, discouraging outside input. These are textbook red flags. Whether they prove wrongdoing is not for the internet to decide. But ignoring them would be irresponsible. The question isn't whether Gloria or Eric intended harm. Intent is hard to prove and easy to debate. The question is whether Betty's autonomy is being protected or undermined. Right now, that answer isn't clear. And when clarity is missing in situations like this, caution is essential. The most important thing Betty needs right now is space. Space to think. Space to speak. Space to consult someone whose only role is to protect her interests, not manage her outcomes. Because once a vulnerable person signs away authority, getting it back is almost impossible. So the question remains, is Betty being supported or steered? Is she being helped or handled? And who benefits most from the way things are unfolding? We want to know what you think. Do these patterns concern you? Have you seen situations like this before? Where do you draw the line between guidance and control? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. By the time people reached this stage of the conversation, the question had changed. It was no longer, is someone influencing Betty Whittaker? It became, why does this situation feel so familiar to people who work with vulnerable adults? Because what stood out to many wasn't just the personalities involved. It was the structure. In cases of undue influence, the same architecture appears again and again. One person becomes the gatekeeper. Information flows through them. Options are narrowed. Alternatives are framed as threats. Over time, The vulnerable person's world shrinks until only one voice feels safe. People watching Betty's situation began mapping that structure, not to accuse, but to understand. The gatekeeping was the first red flag. Gatekeeping isn't loud. It doesn't require confrontation. It simply decides who gets access and who doesn't, who is good and who is bad, who is helpful and who is confusing. Once that distinction is accepted, the gatekeeper no longer needs to argue. They just filter. That filtering appeared consistent. People who asked questions were labeled troublemakers. People who urged caution were accused of causing stress. People who suggested independent advice were framed as enemies. At the same time, the gatekeeper positioned herself as calm, patient, and protective. That contrast matters. Because when someone is framed as the only source of peace in a chaotic environment, dependence grows naturally. The second structural element was narrative control. Narrative control doesn't require lying. It requires repetition. The same explanation given over and over until it becomes the only version that exists. Over time, alternative explanations don't feel wrong. They feel foreign. Observers noticed Betty repeating specific phrases across different conversations. Not paraphrased ideas. Exact wording. That raised concerns because repetition like that often signals coaching rather than comprehension. Coaching doesn't mean malicious intent by default. Sometimes people believe they are helping by simplifying. But simplification becomes manipulation when it removes nuance and choice. Especially when those choices carry long-term consequences. Another layer that concerned people was timing. Every major decision seemed to arrive at a moment of emotional vulnerability. After stress. After conflict. After exhaustion. That's when pressure is most effective. This pattern is well documented. People under emotional strain are more likely to defer decisions to someone else. They're more likely to agree just to make discomfort stop. Several people who claim to have spoken with Betty during these moments described the same thing. She sounded tired, overwhelmed, anxious, not defiant, not resistant, just ready for someone else to take over. That's not empowerment. Empowerment slows things down. Pressure speeds them up. Another troubling aspect was the erosion of contradiction. In healthy decision-making, disagreement is allowed. A person can change their mind. They can ask follow-up questions. They can express uncertainty without consequence. But in this situation, hesitation seemed to trigger immediate correction. Betty would start to express doubt, then retreat. Her statements would suddenly become more definitive, more aligned, less exploratory. That pattern suggests discomfort with uncertainty. And discomfort with uncertainty often points to external pressure. People also began asking why professional advocacy was missing. In situations involving complex legal decisions and vulnerable adults, neutral advocates are standard. Social workers, guardians ad litem, legal aid representatives. Their role isn't to decide outcomes. It's to ensure understanding. But there was no visible neutral party. Instead, the same small circle of people appeared repeatedly. People whose interests were intertwined. People who benefited from Betty moving quickly rather than carefully. That absence is significant, because if everything is above board, transparency helps everyone. Independent oversight protects all parties. It removes suspicion. It validates consent. The lack of it does the opposite. Another issue raised, several accounts describe Betty being warned about consequences if she didn't comply. Losing support. Losing stability. Losing protection. These warnings weren't always explicit, but implication is powerful. When someone believes their safety depends on obedience, consent becomes meaningless. That's why professionals stress informed, voluntary decision-making. Without freedom from fear, decisions aren't truly voluntary. Some observers also noted Betty's increasing reluctance to speak publicly. Her world seemed to close in. Fewer appearances. Fewer unscripted moments. More controlled settings. Privacy can be protective, but secrecy combined with pressure is dangerous. The distinction matters. Protective privacy shields a person from exploitation. Controlling secrecy shields exploitation from scrutiny. Which one applies here is the central question. What escalated concern even further was the talk of long-term authority. People began hearing words like representation, decision-making, handling things for her. Language that implies permanence. Not assistance, but replacement. That's when alarm bells rang. Temporary help is one thing. Permanent authority is another. Once authority shifts, it's incredibly difficult to reverse, especially for someone with limited resources. Those raising concerns emphasized one thing repeatedly. This isn't about vilifying individuals. It's about safeguarding a person who has already lived a life marked by vulnerability. Betty has spent decades caring for others while navigating her own limitations. That history matters. It means she deserves heightened protection now, not diminished autonomy. There's also a broader ethical question here. When a vulnerable person becomes the center of public attention, opportunists emerge. Some seek money. Some seek control. Some seek validation. The chaos creates openings. That's why clear boundaries and professional oversight are essential, not optional. People also began asking why criticism was being treated as hostility. In ethical caregiving, scrutiny is welcomed. It confirms legitimacy. It strengthens trust. When scrutiny is framed as an attack, it raises questions. Why fear examination if intentions are pure? Why discourage second opinions if outcomes are fair? Why isolate if support is genuine? These are the questions people are asking. And they're not asking them lightly, because the cost of getting this wrong is enormous. It's not a YouTube storyline. It's a real person's autonomy. History is full of examples where well-meaning involvement crossed into control, where help became ownership, where voices were lost quietly without drama. That's why vigilance matters. No one is saying Betty can't be supported. She absolutely should be. But support must be transparent, accountable, and free from conflicts of interest. Anything less invites abuse, even if unintentionally. The path forward isn't outrage. It's safeguards, independent advocacy, clear explanations, time to decide, freedom to say no. Those are the standards that protect people like Betty. Until those standards are visibly met, concern will remain justified. So now the question turns to you. Do you see the same patterns? Do you think this situation warrants independent oversight? Where do you believe the line is between assistance and control? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. By this point, one truth becomes unavoidable. Whatever is happening around Betty Whittaker is no longer just about personalities or intentions. It is about power, access, and accountability. And those three things demand clarity, not loyalty. When people talk about pulling the strings, they often imagine something dramatic. Secret meetings, raised voices, threats. But the reality of influence over vulnerable adults is usually quieter than that. It happens through routines, through repetition, through who answers the phone and who doesn't, through who explains the paperwork and who decides when it gets signed. That's why the most important question now isn't who people like or dislike. It's who has leverage. Leverage comes from proximity. Leverage comes from control of information. Leverage comes from being positioned as indispensable. Once someone becomes the only one who understands, they stop being a helper and start being a gate. Many observers have pointed out that Betty's situation reflects a dangerous imbalance. She is facing complex decisions at a moment when her emotional reserves are already strained. Her family has been fractured, her daily life disrupted, her privacy invaded repeatedly over the years. In moments like that, even strong people struggle to advocate for themselves. Betty is not in a strong position. That doesn't mean she is incapable. It means the environment around her matters more than ever. A healthy support system expands options. It introduces multiple perspectives. It encourages questions. It slows the process. It welcomes outside review. An unhealthy one narrows choices. It discourages discussion. It frames urgency as necessity. It treats oversight as hostility. So far, what people are seeing feels closer to the second than the first. Another critical issue is consent versus compliance. Consent requires understanding. Compliance requires pressure. If someone signs something because they trust the person handing it to them, without fully grasping the consequences, that is not informed consent. That is reliance. And reliance is easily exploited. That's why many professionals insist that vulnerable adults should never make binding decisions without independent counsel. Not counsel chosen by interested parties. Truly independent counsel. Yet that safeguard still appears absent. What also troubles many people is how quickly dissent is being reframed as harm. Concern becomes stressful. Questions become attacks. Calls for delay become interference. That framing is powerful because it isolates. It turns reasonable caution into something shameful. It makes people afraid to speak up, even when their instincts tell them something isn't right. But silence doesn't protect vulnerable people. Transparency does. Another aspect that deserves attention is history. Betty has lived most of her life without institutional protection. For decades, no system stepped in when they should have. That history doesn't justify chaos now. It makes careful oversight more urgent. When the system finally arrives late, it often arrives heavy-handed. That's what many fear here. That intervention will come not because safeguards were built early, but because failures stacked up too high to ignore. And when that happens, everyone loses. Those who truly want to help Betty should be the loudest voices calling for transparency. 4 neutral advocates. 4 documented explanations. For time. If the intentions are good, these measures protect everyone involved. If the intentions are not good, these measures expose that. There's also a broader responsibility here, one that extends beyond Betty herself. Public attention has created this environment. Viewers, commenters, creators, all of them helped amplify the situation. That doesn't mean people are to blame for caring. But it does mean care must be matched with restraint. Speculation harms. Harassment harms. Rushing to judgment harms. But asking for safeguards does not. The most ethical position is not choosing sides. It's insisting on process. Process is boring. It's slow. It doesn't make dramatic videos. But it protects people. And protection is the only outcome that matters here. No one should be making irreversible decisions on Betty's behalf without her full understanding. No one should be filtering her world so tightly that alternative voices can't reach her. No one should be positioning themselves as the sole interpreter of her best interests. That's how exploitation hides. As this situation continues to unfold, the focus should remain on a few non-negotiables. Independent advocacy. Clear, repeated explanations in plain language. Documented consent. Time to reconsider. Freedom to consult others without penalty. Anything less is insufficient. The truth is, we may never know every intention. People can believe they are helping while still causing harm. That's why systems exist. Not because individuals are evil, but because power without checks corrodes. Betty deserves checks. She deserves people around her who are accountable to more than themselves. She deserves a future where her voice is not filtered, edited, or managed, but supported. And the public deserves clarity. Not rumors. Not whispers. Not insiders speaking anonymously forever. Clear processes. Clear protections.